started here, and okay, good, we got it. All right, so welcome everyone to Kairos tonight. We have a great speaker with us, and we're looking forward to hearing from Dr. Chris Gehrz, who has his PhD from Yale and is a professor of history at Bethel, where he teaches courses on a wide variety of topics, from the world wars to sports to Christianity. He's the author of and the editor of several books, including Charles Lindbergh, not Bug, Charles Lindbergh, a religious biography of America's most infamous pilot. So this sounds like, just like Claudia said, that it's a very interesting topic. So I am not going to dawdle around any further. I'm going to let Chris get started. And Chris, it's all yours.
All right. Well, thank you, Michael, for the introduction. Thanks everyone for joining. We're counter programming against college football tonight. And this is a great turnout. I didn't know what to expect. I was hoping for 10, and we burst that. I think there are more people here than are going to show up to my class tomorrow morning. So this is encouraging. Let me share my screen so I can show the slides that we'll go with tonight here. All right. So, okay, that should get us there. I will try to sort of keep an eye on the chat window, but also ask Michael to help me out with that, so he'll moderate. We'll have some discussion along the way.
I will be the chat monitor.
Oh, super.
I'll let you know.
Okay, thanks, Carol.
Okay.
So, yeah, let's just dive right into this. It's called subtitled The Religious Biography of America's Most Infamous Pilot. We will get to the most infamous part, I promise you, before we're too far along. But also we'll talk about the famous part of Charles Lindbergh too. But really, this is a spiritual but not religious biography of Charles Lindbergh. And I'll explain what I mean more by that as we go. But I think one thing to make clear right off the bat, this is not a conventional religious sort of story. This is not a story of conversion. This is not the story of someone who ever joined a church. And yet someone who, at least to my surprise, when I first started learning about him, was increasingly interested in spirituality and theology and divinity and mortality, the kind of questions that we like to ask in churches. So let me do, by way of a little bit of an opening exercise to warm us all up to our topic, let me click through to my next slide. So this is part of the cover of my book, but I've left off the subtitle in my name because I want you to just focus on this image in the name you see there, Charles Lindbergh. And my guess is this is a pretty recognizable image still to this point. He's been dead since 1974, a year before I was born. So it's been a while, but especially if you're from Minnesota, you've probably seen him before, and you probably already have something that you associate. So here, if you want to take part in a little activity, go to the chat window. And I'm just curious to sample this group here. What do you associate with this person you see here? So this could be events, it could be themes, it could be other people, could be adjectives, nouns, whatever. I'm just really curious to see what kind of words come to mind when you see the face and the name Charles Lindbergh. So I'll let you think about this and let you jot some things down the chat window, and I'll just kind of curious to see what comes up.
Okay, how about Atlantic Ocean?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't want to give away the plot, but he was kind of a Nazi sympathizer.
It's been a popular choice already. Yeah, so if you're not in the chat window, take a look and you can see the list of names that's already bursting forth here. I can see I've got an audience that knows my topic well. This is great. Let's give you a few more seconds to see what else comes up here.
Okay.
All right, this is great. I mean, this is stuff I would expect. The fact that you're looking at a pilot, it's kind of a giveaway from the particular picture that we've given you of Charles Lindbergh. This, by the way, is a picture of Charles Lindbergh in May of 1927. somewhere on Long Island as he prepared to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. So someone gave the word pensive, which I think is very appropriate to this picture. He's kind of gazing off across the grayness of the Atlantic, pondering what's about to happen, which of course is a famous flight. So a lot of you talked about 1927, talked about flights. Some of you mentioned the kidnapping and murder of his son. We'll come to that. Some of you have mentioned a few other things, maybe getting more at the infamous part, Nazi sympathizing, America first, and one of you called him a philanderer. We'll definitely talk about that before we're done. And then some interesting other things. At least one of you seems to know that he is not, well, he's from Minnesota, but he also ended up living in Hawaii. We'll talk about that before we're done. One of you mentioned the sculpture by Paul Granlund that's on the Capitol Mall, The Man and the Boy, which is an interesting two-part memorial from the 1980s of Charles Lindbergh. And at least one of you knew that he did participate in World War II, even though he opposed American participation in the war. So this is great. And if you didn't know all that, it's fine too. I just thought this is a fairly famous person. And that was my initial title for the book, was The Famous Unknown. And maybe wisely, the publisher decided to go something more straightforward, like the name. But what struck me about Charles Lindbergh is we know a great deal about him, both fame and infamy, but it's the spiritual part that I think is not so well known, right? Even though I kind of queued this up in the beginning, that's not what any of you talked about that's not what you associate with Charles Lindbergh. And so I'll try to explain why I associated spirituality and to some extent religious kind of questing with Charles Lindbergh. So let's get going with telling. What I'm going to do is I'll tell three versions of Charles Lindbergh's story. And well, I'll just kind of keep coming back to the same place. Now, Charles Lindbergh, you might know, is actually born in Detroit, Michigan. That's where his mother, Evangeline, is from. She grows up in Detroit, goes to the University of Michigan, but comes to Minnesota to become a high school science teacher. And Charles Lindbergh spends a little bit of time in Detroit on his way to and forth from Washington, D.C., because for 12 years, his father, C.A. Lindbergh, served as a very progressive Republican in the U.S. House of Representatives. And so to some extent, Charles Lindbergh's story early on includes Michigan, includes the nation's capital, but of course, mostly, as at least one of you mentioned, includes this place. This is a plat map showing the town of Little Falls, Minnesota from the first decade of the 20th century, when Charles Lindbergh was a young boy growing up on a very peaceful part of the Mississippi River. It's called, they actually build the town as the place where the Mississippi rests. It's a bustling town, though. I don't know if you can see, there are a lot of lumber mills along the west bank of the river. And so the town had actually doubled in size right before Charles Lindbergh was born in 1902. And so he spends most of his time growing up in Little Falls and stays there until 1918 when he goes, or 1920 when he goes off to college. This is most of the town. He actually lives downriver a bit. I'm just kind of curious, has anyone gone to the Lindbergh house before? Is anyone? It looks like this if you haven't been there. So it's a little bit further down the river. It's nowadays, there's a state park surrounding it, and this is a state historic site. So you can visit the house in the summer, and then there's also an interpretive center with a small museum that has a flight simulator and some other things right up the trail from the house. This isn't the original house. The first 3 years of his life, Charles Lindbergh lived in a much fancier house befitting his father, who was a prosperous attorney in town, but it burned down when Charles Lindbergh was 3 years old. And his father rebuilt this rather small house that was not winterized. And it suggests something about the marriage of the two Lindberghs was already on the rocks by 1906, but also that C.A. Lindbergh wasn't actually in this house very much. He was usually in Washington or sometimes sleeping in town. But this is where Charles Lindbergh grows up. And one of his most important childhood memories takes him up to the roof of this house in either 1911 or 1912. His account varies a little bit, but sometime when he was still a young boy, he heard an unfamiliar engine, climbed up to the roof and saw an airplane for the first time. And remember, this is only 8 years after Kitty Hawk, right? The airplane is still a novelty, but the very first pilots, to make ends meet, will go from town to town selling rides in an airplane to people in places like Little Falls, Minnesota. That's as close as he got. He didn't actually get to take a ride in an airplane. That would take another 11 years. But at least as he goes back and tells the story, this is what first piqued his imagination, was seeing this thing flying through the air in a very fragile state, but held a lot of promise in his mind. I won't say a lot more about Lindbergh's childhood. That's the subject of the second chapter of the book, and we can come back to it if you're interested, and we'll kind of circle back through Little Falls twice more. Let me skip ahead. In 1918, he graduates from high school. 1920, Lindbergh goes to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, ostensibly to study mechanical engineering. All I'll say about his education is that he was a terrible, terrible student. You can actually find his report cards in the Lindbergh family papers at the Minnesota History Center, and he is, by all accounts, an atrocious student. At Madison, the only thing he's good at is rifle shooting for the ROTC team. And finally, in 1922, he just quits. He gets through about 3 semesters, gives it all up, gets on his motorcycle, drives to Nebraska, and enrolls in a flying school. And he claims the first time he actually saw an airplane up close was before he took his first flying lesson. I would say take a lot of what he says with at least a little bit of a grain of salt, but one way or another, he proves to be a born pilot. And he does well enough that in 1924, he enlists in the Army Air Service and goes to Brooksfield, Texas, and actually will end up graduating first in his class. That's also the year that C.A. Lindbergh dies of a brain tumor. And so he comes back up and scatters his father's ashes over the farm in Little Falls. Charles Lindbergh's a very good pilot. Like I said, he was first in his class. He dodges death on many occasions. He also does some barnstorming, and not just as a pilot, but he likes doing parachute tricks as well. So there's, one of you described him as serious, which is true, and sober is true, but he's also a little bit of a thrill seeker, I think it's fair to say. But as a couple of you pointed out in the chat box, he became a male pilot, right? There aren't a lot of jobs in the peacetime military, and so the only way he can really make ends meet is by flying the mail back and forth between St. Louis and Chicago and teaching students along the way, including a Catholic priest as one of his early students. But he decides he wants a different kind of adventure, and so he enters a competition that's been going on for about 8 years to be the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. And he does this in 33 and a half hours in late May of 1927, from Roosevelt Field on Long Island all the way to a little field outside Paris called Lindburg. And by the time he gets there, word has spread. And you might know that something like 100 to 150,000 people rush out of Paris to go greet the Spirit of St. Louis as it lands at Lindburg. So this is one of the images we have of this tiny, specially constructed, very odd plane landing at this field. And you can kind of see people starting to gather around by some of the other planes on the tarmac. It's a very odd plane. If you haven't seen it before, it's in the Air and Space Museum in Washington. There are replicas in San Diego and other places. Lindbergh actually couldn't really look straight forward, right? He had to kind of look around to see where he was going, but it was built specifically for this purpose, and he succeeded. So I'll say more about the flight if you want to. If you have questions later, there's a whole chapter about it in the book. Although my subject is really not the flight. I am not a pilot. I'm not all that interested in flying. So if you want a book about aviation, I can recommend some others about this flight. What I'm really interested in here is the reaction to Lindbergh. And so here's one of the reactions I quote in my book. It comes from an American expatriate, an editor and a writer named Harry Crosby. He worked with Ernest Hemingway in Paris in the 1920s, and he rushed out. And here's, in a kind of stream of consciousness, how he jotted down his description of the scene at Le Bourget Field. Running people ahead, running people all around us, running, and the crowd behind stampeding like buffalo, and a pushing and a shoving. Where is he? Where is he? Lindbergh, where is he? And the extraordinary impression I had of hands, thousands of hands, weaving like maggots over the silver wings of the Spirit of Saint Louis. And it seems as if all the hands in the world are touching or trying to touch the new Christ, and that the new cross is his plane. And I remember reading that, actually, I read that in graduate school long, long ago before I gave any thought to Lindbergh, thinking that's interesting. I mean, why are people responding in this way to someone flying across the Atlantic? I mean, I've flown across the Atlantic 20 times and it's boring and tedious, right? But in 1927, Lindbergh has captured something. And I don't think it's even just like risk-taking or adventure or celebrity. A lot of it, I think, has to do with World War I. One of the things I teach at Bethel, like that World War I, in ways that I think Americans don't understand, had traumatized the Western imagination and made people wonder about the future of humanity. So to see someone use a piece of technology like this, not for warfare, but simply to push human possibility and to pull countries together and to shrink distances. Right before we started, we were talking about just how Zoom makes it possible for people around the world, from Minnesota to Tanzania, to connect. And think of how small our world has become. I think that's part of what's happening with Lindbergh, is it's shrinking the world and it's suggesting a different kind of future. And so he struck people as a messianic figure, as a Christ-like kind of figure. This is not the only time you find someone comparing him to Jesus or an angel or a demigod or a messenger. I mean, like all sorts of religious imagery from Christians and non-Christians alike attached to Charles Lindbergh in 1927. So we can come back to the flight. Let me run through a little bit more of his biography, then we'll pause and take some questions, and then I'll do the other times through the story. But let me move forward just a little bit here. So in 1927, Charles Lindbergh flies to all 48 of the lower states. And then he starts a Latin American tour in Mexico City and spends Christmas at the US ambassador's residence. The US ambassador is a banker named Dwight Morrow, or a lawyer named Dwight Morrow. And one of the other guests there is his second daughter, Anne Morrow, who is a college senior at Smith College in Massachusetts. They meet. The next year, they start to date. On their second date, Lindbergh proposes. And in 1929, they get married. And she then becomes a hugely important part of my story for reasons I'll get back to, partly because she keeps diaries about all this, partly because she's actually a very gifted aviation writer and a flyer herself, and they have many more trips together. They start a family, but here's where probably the second most famous thing about Charles Lindbergh begins. In May of 1932, their infant son, not yet 2 years old, Charles Jr., is kidnapped, and it turns out died very quickly, but they didn't discover the body for a couple more months. And it's the crime of the century, right? And so this is Bruno Richard Hauptmann, The Trial a few years later. There is a whole genre of Lindbergh books that are really just about the kidnapping. And here too, this is not really the point of my book. What struck me more here was, here too, religion was part of this. Christians pray, there's prayer services. Charles Coughlin, the radio priest, actually leads an ecumenical prayer service and encourages the kidnapper to drop the child off at a convent or a Catholic orphanage. There are seances held and mystics consulted. And to some extent, Anne Lindbergh might have found some solace in her faith. She was raised as a Presbyterian, but Charles Lindbergh, as we'll see, was not. And at one point, he tells his wife, it's all chance. You can't control it, which is not maybe the most comforting thing to tell your grieving wife and the mother of your child who's just died. Anyway, this only enhances their celebrity. And I don't think we really realized just how much the Lindberghs were hounded by the press from 1927 until finally, right before right before Christmas 1935, they suddenly get on a boat and sneak away. And right before New Year's, they get to Liverpool, and they live in England for a few years and then France for about a year. And they both call it one of the happiest times of their life because they're in hiding. They're only as public as they want to be, and they get away from the American press and spend time in exile in Europe. And we'll come back to that. It's actually a really interesting time in their life. But of course, Lindbergh is bound for another kind of publicity because World War II is starting to brew in Europe while they're there. And Lindbergh is asked by the American government to go to different European countries to assess their air forces. So he does this in France, he goes to the Soviet Union, but most famously, he travels 3 times to Nazi Germany to investigate the Luftwaffe. And he sends back what turn out to be wildly wrong estimates of Nazi air power, which was not unusual. The Americans overestimated German air power by a factor of about 10, we think. And Lindbergh then starts to question why America would ever become involved in a war with Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany. And he goes public with that in 1939. He and his family return to the United States, and starting that September, 2 weeks after World War II breaks out, Charles Lindbergh goes on the radio to urge America to stay out of World War II. And then in 1940 and 41, he starts traveling around the country, starting at Yale University, but also coming to places like the Armory in Minneapolis, the Hollywood Bowl, Madison Square Garden twice, to give speeches for a group called America First, which was a very politically and ideologically diverse group of Americans who wanted to stay out of the war against Germany. And Lindbergh was probably the most famous speaker, although that all sinks when he gives a speech in 1941 in Des Moines, Iowa, in which he accuses the Jews of America of trying to suck the United States into the war. And we'll come back to that before we're done. And so I think one thing I was really surprised to see in the chat window is that at least one of you knew that even though Charles Lindbergh is famous or infamous for speaking out against US participation in World War II, he actually participated in World War II, and it really wasn't known until the 1950s. For most of the war, Charles Lindbergh flew as a test pilot for Henry Ford at the Willow Run factory in Michigan. He tested the B-24 bomber, and then he started testing some fighter bombers for the Marine Corps and the Army. And in May of 1944, he secretly deployed to the South Pacific and spent basically the summer of 1944 in the South Pacific, flying 50 combat missions, first for the Marines and then for the Army, against Japanese positions. He bombs Japanese fortifications, he shoots down one Japanese plane, and then the higher ups realize what's happening and they pull him away because they didn't want Lindbergh to be shot down or taken prisoner by the Japanese. So here's an image in the State Historical Society files of Lindbergh at one of these bases. Along the way, he meets John Glenn, amazingly, who was a Marine pilot at the time. We'll talk more about that in a second. And this really is a turning point for Charles Lindbergh. He doesn't really write about this for another 10 years, but many people who know him, including his wife and children, say this was a hinge in his life. And it deeply changed how he thought about, especially science and technology. I'll try not to tell all the story at once because I want to come back to the 40s and 50s in my second version of the story. Here, let me address one of the elephants in the room that one of you hinted at, and this was not known until 20 years ago. In 1957, Charles Lindbergh met a woman in Munich, Germany, and started an affair with her, had children with her, then started an affair with her sister, had children with her, and started an affair with his European secretary and had children with her. None of them knew that their father was Charles Lindbergh. He was just a visiting American businessman. And this was all secret, even certainly from Anne Morrill Lindbergh, until 2001, when the first of these European women died, when Anne Lindbergh died. And 2 years later, some of the German children came out, and then they wrote a book that's still only available in German. So this is another part of the Lindbergh story. I don't dwell on this at any length, except to say it suggests just how mysterious and secretive Charles Lindbergh was. This is not someone who especially wanted people to know him and went to great lengths to conceal important parts of his life from us, which, if nothing else, should make you just a little bit skeptical that I can really tell you anything about Charles Lindbergh, right? Because he makes his records available, but he also tries to hide a lot about himself. And so we'll see how well a biographer can really get to know him. So one final thing just to mention here, Lindbergh has a kind of comeback in the 1960s for various reasons, one of which is that he is seen as a pioneer of the space race. All sorts of astronauts talk about Charles Lindbergh. They're treated like Lindbergh. Neil Armstrong is picked in part because he reminds NASA of Charles Lindbergh. In fact, Lindbergh visits Cape Kennedy several times, and he's shown around in 1968 by Neil Armstrong. And then in July of 1969, he actually comes to watch the launch of Apollo 11, hangs out with Alan Shepard, and that's part of the story as well. 5 years later, Charles Lindbergh dies of lymphatic cancer. And by that point, he owned a house in Hawaii. And when he knew that he only had a week to live, he got on an airliner, flew the other direction across the Pacific Ocean, and spent the last days of his life planning his own funeral. Including the inscription you see on his tombstone. I don't know if you can read what that says. Does anyone know what that's from? This is scripture. It says, "If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea." Here's my first hint of the religious side of Charles Lindbergh. So this is a long psalm, but it's one verse. This is Psalm 139, I think, verse 9. So this is something he chose for himself. I would also suggest look up Psalm 139, look at the verses around it to see what he left out. For example, this is a psalm basically about our relationship to God. You wouldn't know that from the verse that Charles Lindbergh picked, right? And that probably says something by itself. But he picked this site, and he picked it in part because it was close to a church. In fact, to this church. This is Palapalohoameo. This is on the Hana coast of Maui. This was a missionary church built around 1860 by Congregationalists from New England. And so it's a very difficult site to get to. I've not yet had a chance to get to it, but it takes a while to get there. The church is only intermittently in use to this point, but he wanted something close to a church. He designed a funeral service with hymns and readings and prayers. And so it's our first hint that there's another story of Charles Lindbergh that I haven't yet told, which is his spiritual journey. So let me pause here, and then if there are any questions, we can talk about it for a little while. And then I'll go back to Little Falls and start telling the spiritual journey of Charles Lindbergh that I've kind of skipped past on way. But first of all, any questions about the kind of famous parts that I've talked about? You can certainly pause here to talk for as long as you want. So upbringing in Minnesota, the flight across the Atlantic, the kidnapping, America first. I probably can't tell you a lot more about the affairs with women in Europe. I've kind of exhausted my knowledge of that. But anything else you want to talk about, we can pause here before we get to the spiritual stuff.
How much did he actually come back to Minnesota and hang out at all in Little Falls?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. Only from time to time. I mean, he certainly visited, even in the 1920s, even in 1927, he comes back to Little Falls as part of his victory tour. The house was torn apart by souvenir seekers. It's more, though, at the end of his life that he comes back. There are visits in the 1930s that I talk about in the book. It's really, though, at the end of his life when he comes back, partly out of a typical story. If you get to a point in your life where you want to kind of think back over where you came from, right? It's partly because they dedicated a new interpretive center. And so one of the last speeches Lindbergh gives is actually at the dedication ceremony in 1973. So you can actually, if you go to the State Historical Society site and look up Lindbergh photographs, you'll find these kind of poignant shots of Charles Lindbergh when he's about 68 to 72 years old, sitting in the drawing room or kind of walking around this place where he spent his childhood. So it's a place he was never entirely absent from, but he never lived again in Minnesota. The Lindberghs kind of moved around a great deal. In addition to Europe, they lived in parts of New Jersey at the time of the kidnapping, Long Island. Most of the second half of their marriage, they lived in Darien, Connecticut. And then they also built a house in Switzerland and a small one in Hawaii. That's why they went there for his death.
There are a couple of other questions in the chat. One is there any truth to the theory that he had a hand in his child's abduction?
I will say there is no evidence whatsoever. There's a great deal of speculation. I decided not to deal with this in the book because it really wasn't about the kidnapping. I remember in graduate school, I had books on my reading list by a historian named Lloyd Gardner, who I think taught at Rutgers University. I mean, a very respected diplomatic historian, but in retirement, Lloyd Gardner became convinced of what you just said, which is that Charles Lindbergh actually was responsible for kidnapping and killing his own son. And I'm not really sure what to make of that. I mean, I think Gardner's theory was, to hint at something we'll come back to later, Charles Lindbergh, among other things, ended up believing in something called eugenics, and the belief that humans can use various techniques to enhance the gene pool, which can include encouraging certain kinds of traits, but also discouraging other kinds of traits. And so there's a theory circulating out there that Charles Lindbergh Jr. had some sort of birth deformity, and that his eugenicist dad couldn't stand the sight of a malformed son, and so had him kidnapped and killed. I don't know what to say. There's absolutely no evidence of that I find credible. I don't know if Hauptmann was the guy who actually did it. I am agnostic on that question. I think it definitely points to a dark side of Charles Lindbergh. He was definitely more stoic than you would imagine any grieving father to be, and his wife comments on that. But so was her mother. She says exactly the same thing about her mother, right? I mean, some people just grieve differently. So I think that's all I'll try to say about that, because we're veering into conspiracy theory at this point, and I don't find empirical evidence to support it.
And there's one other question. Are there any living descendants now, either legitimate or illegitimate?
I'm not sure about the illegitimate. There were 7 of them. I'm not sure if any of those children have died. They were born between 1957 and 1969, so I'd imagine most of them are alive. Not all of them have gone public. Actually, as far as I know, only 3 did. Of his 6 ultimately surviving children with Anne Morrow Lindbergh, I think 3 or 4 are alive. Anne Jr. died, I think, in the 1990s. I think John Lindbergh just died this past summer, actually about 2 weeks before my book came out. The only one that I've ever talked to is their youngest child, Reeve Lindbergh, who was born right at the end of World War II. So Reeve Lindbergh is a very gifted writer. She writes children's books mostly. She's spoken in Minneapolis a few times, and just a lovely person. She's very generous. She would answer emails. She is the only non-reclusive Lindbergh child. I encountered a couple of the grandchildren at the archives at Yale, but otherwise, most of his kids try to keep out of the public eye, I think pretty understandably at this point. To some extent, they had a role in the family foundation, which I might talk about later. So it's either 3 or 4
There's
of
one
the
other
American
question.
kids. Yep.
There's one other question that maybe kind of leads into where you're headed.
Mhm.
The question is, did Anne's spirituality have much influence on Charles Lindbergh, and did he write at all about his own spirituality? And
Yeah.
I will.
That is a perfect
Close out.
segue into our next section, because I want to talk about, yes, I'll certainly talk about Charles Lindbergh's writings about spirituality. And yes, I do think Anne Lindbergh here is a very important influence on Charles Lindbergh. In many ways, she broadens his horizons, and that I think includes not just in terms of literature and philosophy and art and music, but also in spirituality. So that's a good reminder that I should talk more about who Anne Lindbergh was, even as I tell the Charles Lindbergh story. So let's go back to Little Falls, to a different Congregationalist church, actually founded later than the one in Hawaii. This is First Congregational Church of Little Falls, Minnesota. This is the version that was built in the late 1890s. So it's here on the other side of the river if you ever go to Little Falls. I'm not actually sure the building is still there. That church merged with the Methodist church in town back in the 1960s. So that building is not in use if it's still there. But this was kind of the center of town. C.A. Lindbergh, his father's law office was just a couple blocks away on Broadway over here. It's a little unclear how often the Lindbergh family went to this church. Charles Lindbergh's father was actually married once before in the 1890s. And his wife died suddenly, and this is where her funeral was held. And it's where Charles Lindbergh's grandfather's funeral was held in the 1890s. Growing up, though, there's a little bit of a discrepancy between what Charles Lindbergh says and what his mother says. Evangeline Lindbergh says they were very regular churchgoers. Charles Lindbergh claims it happened very rarely. And here again, it's hard to know who to trust. Neither person has an entirely reliable memory. I think Charles is probably closer to right. But here's the first thing we know about Charles Lindbergh's religious upbringing. In the 1940s, he started writing a memoir that was ultimately published in 1953. So what I'm quoting here is from a manuscript held at the Library of Congress in Washington. This was written around 1949. He writes his reflection on what it was like to be bundled up and sent off to this church when he was about 6 or 7 years old. So he says, church, how I dislike that word, although I'm not quite sure what it means. It's keeping me away from the farm where we usually drive on Sunday mornings. So what Lindbergh tells us, and again, this is when he's 47 years old, he's looking back, but he claims this was an unusual thing. He suspects that it only happened because his father was running for office and they wanted to make a public show of religiosity. And he says he hated it. He says it was uncomfortable, it was confusing, it was boring. All he wanted to do was go back to the farm, go hunting, go swimming in the Mississippi River, and here his parents were making him go to church. So that's part of his story, is that if he went to church at all, he didn't like it, and it wasn't very consistent. And at the same time, he also says his parents didn't seem all that religious. His great-grandfather on his mom's side was actually a fundamentalist preacher with the Disciples of Christ who had baptized people in a lake in Michigan. But his mother was not very religious. Charles Lindbergh recalls reading the Bible with his mother, and then she would tell him, of course, we don't know if this is true. So there are a lot of Bibles in Lindbergh house. It's not exactly clear how they viewed scripture. C.A. Lindbergh, his father, apparently didn't go to church much at all until late in life when he attended the Unitarian Society in Minneapolis. Instead, C.A. Lindbergh seemed to find God in nature. And I talk about this a couple of points in the book. Like, it was walking through the woods, walking by the river is where C.A. Lindbergh experienced the divine. So not an especially religious house, but also not a house that was entirely disinterested in God. in metaphysics, in ethics. There are actually all sorts of interesting books in the Lindbergh Library that I talk about. But I think it's fair to say Charles Lindbergh is not especially religious growing up. But as he looked back, he claims in his later memoirs that even as a child, he had all sorts of religious or theological questions. What is God? What do we mean by that? Why does God behave the way he does? Where did we come from? I mean, all the kind of questions most of us ask at some point in our life. Charles Lindbergh insists he always was curious about. He just didn't find answers in church. And that's kind of his version of the story. And I think it's probably true of the first almost 3 decades of his life. Really, up until the 1930s, there's very little evidence that Charles Lindbergh has any interest at all in anything remotely resembling spirituality, let alone religion. So how does that change? Here's where the story needs to add a few years. So in 1930, Charles Lindbergh's sister-in-law was dying of a heart condition. And while his own child was being born, Charles Lindbergh talked to his wife's anesthesiologist, who was a Catholic surgeon, and asked him, well, why can't we do heart surgery? Why can't we take care of my sister-in-law? And this anesthesiologist said, oh, I know who you should talk to. There's this guy at the Rockefeller Institute named Alexis Carrel, and he's doing research on this. And sometime in 1930, in November, Charles Lindbergh had lunch at the Rockefeller Institute with Alexis Carrel. Now, I'll just ask you, has anyone heard of Alexis Carrel before? Does that name mean anything to anyone sitting in on this call? Because I will tell you, and this is not to make you feel bad about yourself, I had never heard of him either. Alexis Carrel won a Nobel Prize in 1912, and he had a best-selling book in 1935. Right? This, in his own time, was a very significant figure, but almost entirely forgotten. He was a fascinating figure. He was a world-class surgeon and medical researcher. He won his Nobel Prize for very early work on stitching blood vessels together. And then he came to the Rockefeller Institute in New York and continued research. And so when he met Lindbergh, they actually started a very productive research relationship that developed this pump here. It was a perfusion pump. It was able to keep tissue alive for experimentation. And so it's a very early forerunner of some of the hydraulic technology used in open heart surgery. And Charles Lindbergh, even though he never graduated from college and shouldn't have graduated from high school, got published in the journal Science, right, in the 1930s because of this connection with Alexis Carrel. And in some respects, that kind of fits. Charles Lindbergh is this figure who draws on science and technology to make his name. And so he thought biological research would be the next sort of adventure for him. But what's really striking about Carrel is that he's not just a scientist and a surgeon, he's also a Catholic mystic. So Alexis Carrel is born, I think, in Lyon, France, and educated by the Jesuits, and goes through a period of pretty significant skepticism. But then, because he hears about the healing miracles at Lourdes in France, he starts to say maybe there are things that science can't explain, or at least science as we define it can't explain. And so alongside his scientific research, Carrel is increasingly interested in understanding supernatural phenomenon, miraculous healing, in saying maybe we need to break down the boundaries between science and religion, between the physical and the spiritual. And you can only imagine conversations he has about this with Charles Lindbergh, because all of a sudden in the 1930s, you can find private papers of Charles Lindbergh where he starts to speculate about this. Like after he finds out that his son is killed, he tells his wife at one point, well, it was probably just chance. We can't control that. There's no rhyme or reason for it. But then later that same year, he tells her, I'm not convinced that when we die, that's it. I'm not convinced we're just physical molecules that decay and disassemble. I think we'll continue on in some way. I think we'll see each other again, right? And it's kind of vague hinting that there's life after death, right? So something is going on because of Carrel in the 1930s. And so the Lindberghs go to Europe, and when they're in England and France, they spend a lot of time with Alexis Carrel and his wife. In fact, they moved to France so they could be on an island in Brittany close to the Carrel's house. While they're there, they become interested in supernatural phenomena. And at Carrel's suggestion, they take a long flight all the way to Calcutta, India, in order to attend a World Religions Congress held in honor of a Hindu mystic. And Charles Lindbergh is very interested in things like hypnosis and faith healing and he wants to learn more about yoga at one point. Right, so he's not conventionally religious in any way. He doesn't attend church. He doesn't belong to any kind of organized religion, but he's increasingly curious about what goes beyond the natural, the mechanical, the physical, the scientific. And Carell is obviously the big influence here. But I think the other big influence is kind of hinted is Anne Morrow Lindbergh. Anne Lindbergh grew up as a devout Presbyterian. Both her parents came from this kind of tradition. They had morning and evening prayers, regular church attendance, Sunday school, memorizing the catechism. She even attended chapel at Smith College. And over time, she really drifted away from that. And she later called herself a lapsed Presbyterian. But much more so than Charles, she held on to this. She quoted the Bible constantly. She was very interested in Christian mysticism. She was especially interested in poetry and music and nature and how they can make us closer to God. I would guess some of you at some point have encountered this book, Gift from the Sea. This is Anne Lindbergh's probably best-selling book. It was written in 1955, and it's a very short kind of meditation on what she calls grace, or living in grace. And she says at one point that's not necessarily just found in church. It can be found on a beach, right? This is all about different seashells that she sees. But she remains interested in how do we encounter God? How does humanity encounter the divine? And to some extent, at least, she seems to push Charles Lindbergh in those directions, and that includes towards Christianity. At some point during World War II, Charles Lindbergh starts mentioning in his diary that he's been reading the New Testament. And in fact, in 1944, when he deploys to the South Pacific, he's only allowed to bring two things with him. He brings a little leather diary that he keeps, and he brings a New Testament that he buys in New York City. And it's the first time he seems to have taken Christianity at all seriously. Now, he never converts to Christianity. There's no kind of story like this. He never joins a church. He continues to have a very amorphous idea of God, and he certainly doesn't think that Jesus was the Son of God or that he was resurrected. But in 1948, Charles Lindbergh made his kind of public comeback by writing a small little book called A Flight in Life. I mean, it's very hard even to describe what this book is about. It's only about 60 pages long. Some of it is about the early Cold War and the dangers of communism. But the main theme of the book is that while we need technology in the modern age, we can't be controlled by it. And this is what I mean about World War II being a really transformative moment in his life. He was really appalled to see how technology was being used to slaughter humanity. And he meant that from watching combat in the South Pacific, but also because he toured sites of Allied bombing in Germany in 1945. And then a couple of years later, he flew over Hiroshima and still saw this kind of like ruined city. And so the main theme of the book is that we have to use science, but we have to temper science with the wisdom of religion and of ethical traditions. And so he quotes from Jewish scripture, he quotes from Eastern religion, but most importantly, he quotes numerous times from the Gospels. And he talks a lot about Jesus as a wise teacher, and says that humanity is doomed if it can't learn to fuse scientific progress with ethical restraint and religious wisdom. It's a very strange little book. It's not especially popular, but it does well enough that the publisher asked him to write more of a memoir the next time, which he'd already been working on. In 1953, he publishes a book called The Spirit of St. Louis, which wins the Pulitzer Prize the next year. And it's a genuinely very good memoir. It's fascinating. And what's most fascinating about Spirit of St. Louis is that the middle of it should be really boring. It's the story of someone flying across an ocean for 33 hours by themselves with nothing to do, right? But what he does is in the middle of the book, he uses those moments, and hour by hour, he flashes back in his memory to earlier times in his life, and he ruminates on all sorts of things, including that's where he starts talking about what it was like to go to church. And that's where he says, here's where my questions about God came and about science came. And at one point he says, how can you be agnostic up here? You know, how can we not believe in something greater than ourselves up here, 10,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean? And most famously, at one point, he says that he was accompanied by phantasms, by ghosts, by spirits that filled the fuselage and talked to him and kept him company along his solitary journey. And he insisted it was not a hallucination. And he had actually first written about this about 15 years earlier. He never told anyone, but he claimed that he had almost kind of like crossed into the spiritual realm, or at least the spirits had entered the physical realm. And that's all part of a Pulitzer Prize winning book in 1953 by Charles Lindbergh. And so I think those are some of the hints we get of someone who's interested in much more than how can a machine take us across an ocean, right? He's really starting to spend more and more of his time reflecting not on aviation, but on the nature of God and the nature of mortality and what it means to be human and what happens after we die. Those are all the themes that drive the rest of his life. A couple more things to add, then I'll pause for some questions because we're kind of in the meat of our story here. Two other things that Charles Lindbergh is somewhat famous for late in life. In 1962, he's invited to Kenya and Tanzania to visit the people group known as the Maasai. He had actually encountered them at a religion congress in Switzerland in 1961, and he was really taken with the Maasai delegate, partly because despite the efforts of European Christian missionaries, the Maasai had a very different idea of God, and Lindbergh resonated with it. The Maasai told him that they found God in nature, in a mountain, in the trees, and the savannah, right, in the animals. And they thought they were all part of a single kind of divinity living in this world. And Lindbergh increasingly muses about this. And he starts talking about something he calls the life stream. And at one point, he's camping near Mount Kilimanjaro, and he imagines dying and his molecules being absorbed back into the earth. And he says that my life will continue on, just like all the animals that have died and all the trees that have died. So he becomes something like a pantheist or a panentheist, right? That you can find God everywhere on earth, and we're all part of something beyond this earth. But the other thing that strikes him from hanging out with people groups in Africa and Pacific Islands, or later on the Philippines, is he's really struck by how little they depend on technology and how closely they live in association with nature. And he finds this increasingly more appealing than the modern West. And so even though he keeps consulting with airlines this whole time, now he really starts to be drawn towards environmental protection and conservation. And really for the last 8 to 10 years of his life, most of his public efforts are dedicated to things like preserving endangered species. He gives a speech to the Alaska State Legislature for the first public speech since America First about protecting wolves. He lobbies for the creation of Voyageurs National Park in northern Minnesota, and for the preservation of other wildernesses. He speaks on a congressional hearing arguing against an American version of the supersonic transport, the Concorde, because he thinks it'll produce air and noise pollution. And he tries to raise money for the World Wildlife Fund. I mean, that's what he spends most of the last 10 years of his life doing. And it's partly because of encounter with these non-Western pantheistic peoples for whom the barrier between humanity and nature, between the physical and the spiritual, is much more porous than it is in the modern West. And Lindbergh's very drawn to that. And throughout this whole time, he's working on his last book. He's asked to write a much longer memoir, and he never finishes it. And it's a very odd read because it jumps around his life, and it's really more of a reflection on where did his ideas come from, or where did his values come from. It's finally published 4 years after his death as Autobiography of Values. And I can't recommend this book. It's a very difficult book to read through. It's very self-indulgent. He just kind of ruminates on things and then he moves on to another topic. And it's partly the way that they had edited it together. But it reflects a lot about where his mind and his heart were at the end of his life. I mean, he is not interested in technological achievement. That is not his primary concern. He is not interested in celebrity or fame. He is not really interested in foreign policy. He's interested in how do we get closer to the earth? How do we preserve wild things? And how do we encounter a God who's found in nature? That's what drives him at the end of his life. And so the Lindbergh Foundation that's set up after his death is dedicated to themes like that. Like how do we balance technology and preservation of the environment? How do we balance mind, body, and spirit? Those are the kind of themes the Lindbergh Foundation works on. So there's a little bit of the probably much less well-known spiritual biography of Charles Lindbergh. And there's one more story I need to tell because I haven't quite got at the infamous part yet, and I need to explain where that comes in. But let me pause here, because my guess this is all fairly new, although some of it you might have at least heard a little bit about. So are there any questions about this portion or this version of the Lindbergh story? By the way, I think Alabama is beating Georgia 3-0 if you're trying to keep an eye on this at the same time.
It's interesting. He sounds like a man who's a little bit lost and is just sort of scratching around looking for something that will engage him like flight once did.
Yeah, I think that's fair. There is a little bit of the child who loses interest in things to the adult Lindbergh, right? I mean, he's kind of like my dad, actually. My dad will get these hobbies that he throws himself into for 5 years, then he'll utterly drop them, move on to something else. And that's a little bit what Lindbergh looks like. But I think the really important theme here is if he's lost, it's partly because he's insisting on doing this himself. At one point, we're going to call this book Flying Solo, because an editor at the publisher thought that'd be a clever way of tying together some themes, because that's what he's best known for in flight. But I think it is a way of thinking about this spiritual journey. This is not under anyone's guidance. Some of his friends even tell him this, like, you're not a joiner, and you'll never submit to anyone's authority on any of this. You're just going to kind of flit around, finding your own path and deciding it's right. But in some ways, it's very honest. There's definite curiosity here. I mean, one thing that actually, as I step back from all of this, that impresses me about Charles Lindbergh is, like, unlike in my case, he did not have the benefit of a good education, right? I mean, his parents were separated. He never stayed in one place for more than a few months. He changed schools all the time. The way teaching was done at that point did not fit well with someone who wanted to be outside, was very physically active. And instead, he became a self-taught man. I mean, he learned by reading and by talking to people and by visiting museums. And he was an autodidact, which in many ways is a very admirable kind of thing. He did not want to stay put. He wanted his mind to keep moving. It also meant he didn't always have the guidance of teachers to challenge some of his ideas or ask hard questions about his ideas, which is maybe where some of the next story will come from.
Yeah. I don't remember you mentioning that he worked someplace, what was his source of support other than his own writings?
Oh, this is an excellent question that I didn't even try to explain in the book. I would say here, if you really want to know the things that I'm kind of skipping past, this is the still go-to book by Scott Berg. This won the Pulitzer back in the late 90s. This was the first biography written with full access to the Lindbergh papers, which were only made available to the public after Anne Lindbergh died of Alzheimer's in 2001. So read Scott Berg for better answers to some of these questions. But here's why I'd say it's true. Charles Lindbergh didn't really have a job. Once he was done being a mail pilot, he never really did go back to employment in any sense. So his income came, eventually from royalties from the books that he published. He married into wealth. Anne had some money and some royalties of her own. Most of it came from consulting, I would say. Right off the bat, he was put on retainer by airlines, TWA most famously, which got him in some legal trouble during the first FDR term. But he kept consulting. He very close friends with like the Pan Am administration in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. He also consulted for the US Air Force during the Cold War. So I would guess a lot of it came from that and from the gifts of friends. And somehow he lived in these very fancy places. Like, man, I lived in New Haven, Connecticut for graduate school. Darien, Connecticut was not a cheap place to live. I don't know how they afforded that house. And Long Island was kind of the same way. So it's a little bit of a mystery to me how he could travel the world and live in Switzerland and Hawaii when he didn't really keep a job any of this time. So he had income streams from somewhere. But my guess is he probably would flit off to his adventures, and Anne would probably have to make ends meet with the 6 children and the house falling apart.
He also seems to have.
There's another interesting point. There's another interesting point that David raised. I've read that many atheists tend to have had a difficult relationship with their father or a distant father. It sounds like this might have been an influence with Lindbergh. Also, his relationship with traditional understanding of the Christian God. So I'm going to raise that one.
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating question. I hadn't thought of that. So I don't know how true that. I'm not an expert on atheism. I'm not sure how true that is. All I can say is that's not true of Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh only, well, not only, he's complicated, but he mostly has very good things to say about his father and about their relationship. I mean, in a sense, it's distant, right? Because his father's in Washington, but his mother, even though there was this estrangement, would take Charles all the way to Washington, and he would hang out on the floor of the Capitol with his father. The House was in session. He has very fond memories of like walking together with his father and having conversations with his father. What he's a little fuzzier on is what they actually talked about. Because partly as a biographer, I'd love to know, C.A. Lindbergh probably mused about finding God in nature with his son. It's not clear that's what they actually talked about. Charles says it was more about hunting and farming and fishing and shooting and stuff like that. No, he actually has very close relationships with both his parents and seems, as best he could, to have navigated this very tempestuous relationship that Evangeline and C.A. Lindbergh had with each other, and remain close with both of them throughout until their deaths. Evangeline died in the
And there's
1950s, by the way.
And there's one other question. Is there any indication that his spirituality was initiated when his son was abducted in order to find a connection with the lost child?
That's another really interesting question. I've done a few of these now, and I have to say, you're coming up with questions I've never heard before. I would say that that actually probably describes Anne Morrow Lindbergh better. I mean, as I mentioned in real passing, there was actually a seance held in the nursery at the house in New Jersey. So a kind of spiritualist had offered to come in and try to establish a connection with the child. And it seems like Anne was at least mildly interested in that. There's no evidence Charles was especially interested in that. I think what's more true is that whether it's a causal relationship or just a coincidence, this is about the same time. I think he is asking these kind of Alexis Carrel questions, right? Is there something beyond death? What is the nature of the spiritual? It can't all be mechanical and physical, right? Like, I think he is thinking of those questions. I think they come more from this conversation with Carrel than maybe from the death of his child. Part of the problem here, though, to be honest, is Charles Lindbergh says almost nothing about the death of his child. And I think this actually partly would feed some of the more conspiracy-minded explanations, right? He writes this meandering autobiography, and there's maybe a total of 2 pages about the kidnapping, murder, and trial all put together. And there's almost no emotion in it. There's no like reflection on it. He says nothing about it, unlike his wife, who writes a great deal in her diaries. And then when she publishes her diaries in the 1970s, when she comes to that one, she even pauses the volume halfway through to say, like, I've got to talk about this. I've got to talk about how I process sorrow and what helped me with it. And later in her life, she writes letters to other people who have lost children to talk about, here's what it's like to go through this kind of loss. So I think that's I can see the speculation there. I don't think it probably is true, but maybe in the case of Anne Lindbergh, a little bit more. Okay, I do see a question about IQ there, if you want to ask. Yep.
Yeah, I saw that one. Yeah.
I don't have an answer to that question. I don't know if you ever did take an IQ test. I would assume so, because he entered the military, and for a while they were giving all recruits an IQ test. So I'm sure the answer is somewhere. If you find it, let me know, because I'd be curious. I do think Charles Lindbergh is a very intelligent person. I'm not sure he's as intelligent as he thought he was. And I think in many ways, his lack of education shows up in certain ways. But I mean, he's obviously quite brilliant in several different realms, right? And is able to learn things very quickly and to problem solve. So I think he's quite a bright person at the very least. Okay, should I tell you the Lutheran story? Figure I'm talking to a Lutheran group. I'm going to a Lutheran church now. Let me tell you the Lutheran story of Charles Lindbergh. Although I have to say, there's kind of I'm cheating here a little bit. So let's go back to Little Falls one more time. Let's cross back to the west side. So remember, the Lindbergh house is down south as you follow the river, but right along Broadway, there's a little dot here. At that intersection is this church. So this is Bethel Evangelical Lutheran Church. It no longer meets there. It moved further to the west down Broadway some time ago. So this is an abandoned church building. Excuse me, in Little Falls. But it was built about the same time Charles Lindbergh was a small child, early in the 20th century. It's pretty clear that C.A. Lindbergh knew this church well. He actually sold land to its sister congregation in the countryside, and one of its former pastors became his legal secretary at some point around 1910. So clearly he knew about Bethel Lutheran Church. And at least one Lindbergh biographer says Charles Lindbergh attended Bethel Evangelical Lutheran Church. And I thought that was interesting. And so when I visited Little Falls, I made sure to take a picture. And then I realized at some point along the way, there's absolutely no way that Charles Lindbergh attended Bethel Evangelical Lutheran Church. And it's partly because I found evidence that he was going to this Congregational church on the other side of the river. But does anyone have any idea why there's no way that the Lindberghs could have attended Bethel Lutheran Church in Little Falls, Minnesota? It's a very pragmatic reason, I think.
Some woman he was having an affair with.
Well, he was only 6 or 8 at that point. Probably not that. No, it was built when he lived there. They drove right by it the very few times they went across the river to so here's the issue. So you've got Bethel Lutheran Church, which is an Augustana church. There's also a Norwegian Lutheran church, and there's also, from my home denomination, a Mission Friend Covenant church. All 3 of them spoke Scandinavian languages up until about 1920 or so. Charles Lindbergh did not know any Swedish whatsoever. His mother was not Swedish. She didn't know any Swedish. C.A. Lindbergh knew enough to do like basic legal business but he was not raised to speak English, even though he was born in Sweden. He moved over when he was 1 year old, when his father, for reasons you'll have to read the book to understand, decided to leave, and he was raised to speak English. He raised his son to speak English, and Charles Lindbergh, I mean, if they ever went, he wouldn't have understood anything because it was all in Swedish until after World War I. And I actually think that's significant by itself. So this is the kind of trick. There actually is not a Lutheran story, but there should be, right? These are the Lindberghs, right? I mean, these are Swedish immigrant folk, right? Why are they not going to the Augustana Lutheran Church here in town, or to the Mission Covenant Church, or even crossing over to the Norwegian church, right? This should strike you as significant for all sorts of reasons, as a kind of dog that didn't bark in the midnight, right? It should have happened, but it didn't. And here's my leap of explanation. Let me go forward now to the late 1930s. And here's why I think this is significant. And this is why I've been skipping over the whole time. So I mentioned that Charles Lindbergh visited Nazi Germany 3 times. From 1936 to 1938, he even thought about living in Berlin in late 1938, and then Kristallnacht happened. But in 1938, he was even given a swastika emblazoned medal from Hitler by Hermann Goering, who'd invited him in the first place and was his host at the Summer Olympics of 36. So some of you mentioned that Charles Lindbergh is a Nazi sympathizer. There are a lot of reasons Americans opposed intervention in World War II, and Lindbergh opposed it because she was a pacifist who hated what happened in World War I. And then later in life, she rethought this. Charles Lindbergh opposed it in part because he was not just a Nazi sympathizer, but a white supremacist. Here's a little bit of what Charles Lindbergh is thinking at this time. So 1 month before he met with Goering, he started writing an article that fortunately for him was never published, in which he asked, shall we submerge the spirit and life of Europe in the yellow of Asia or the black of Africa? The article was all about the theme of the necessity of inequality for a functioning human society. Lindbergh hated the idea of equality. He thought it produced mediocrity. And specifically, he hated the idea of racial equality, because he believed that while each race had its own gifts, he very clearly thought that the white race was supreme. And so partly he's opposing World War II because he thinks that if America is going to fight anyone, it should be what he calls Asiatic Russia and the communists of Joseph Stalin. And they should be worried about Japan and China and Africa. That's what they should worry about, not the Nazis. Now, that's all private. He never published any of that. But a year later, in November of 1939, after he came back to the United States to speak out against intervention, he published an article in Reader's Digest, of all places, in which he argued, for a lot of reasons, the US shouldn't intervene, but here is the most infamous bit of it. He wrote, again, Reader's Digest, which is about as public as you can be in 1939, our civilization depends on a united strength among ourselves, on a Western wall of race and arms which can hold back either a Genghis Khan or the infiltration of inferior blood. There's a little bit of your eugenics that I mentioned. On an English fleet, a German Air Force, a French army, and American nation standing together as guardians of our common heritage. I mean, he dialed back on this once he started giving the America First speeches. People suggested maybe you shouldn't couch the argument in this kind of term. But early on, it's very clear. The reason that the US should not fight a war against Nazi Germany is that there's no reason the Germans should be fighting the English and French. Lindbergh thought they should all be allied together in a Western wall of race and arms against the yellow of Asia and the black of Africa. That's how he thought about civilizational and racial struggle. The Nazis were our natural racial allies in Lindbergh's mind. So I do want to say later in life, partly through the experience of encountering the Japanese in World War II and then Pacific Islanders and Africans later in life, I think to some extent Lindbergh rethinks some of the racial supremacy stuff. But at least the 1930s and well into the 1940s, this is all there, right? So what does this have to do with the Lutheran Church in Little Falls, Minnesota that he never attended? I think there are two things here. One is this. At what point do people like Swedish Americans start to think of themselves as members of the white race? This is actually a really interesting topic historians spend a lot of time looking at, because if you had asked my ancestors who left Sweden in 1875 and came to places like Wisconsin, Illinois, Minnesota, they would not have said that they were members of the white race. That never would have occurred to them. That they would have said they are Swedish, right? Like that's how they identify it. And well into the 20th century, that's how most immigrants identify from Europe to the United States. But at a certain point, in the second or the third generation, as they assimilate in language and culture, there's all sorts of evidence of these immigrant groups stopping the old identification and starting to think of themselves as white. For example, in the 1920s, Swedish Americans start joining the Ku Klux Klan, and they start supporting initiatives to limit migration from Latin America and Asia. Right? And so there are whole books on this. One of them that I mentioned that I can't hold up for you is by Erica Jackson called Swedes in Chicago, which is all about this theme. You know, how do you get from thinking yourself as an immigrant from Europe to being white, to being Nordic, right? So what does this have to do with Nazi Germany? This is part of it, right? How does Charles Lindbergh start to see himself as part of a racial competition in which he has something in common with the Nazis, right? I think it starts with the fact that his father pretty quickly on decides you're not Swedish, right? You're going to join the mainstream of middle-class America. You're going to speak their language. You're going to be like the Anglo-Saxons. This is how Swedes became white in the United States, and Norwegians became white, and Italians became white, and everyone else became white. It might seem like a very small thing, but had he instead been raised to speak Swedish, attend a Swedish church, it probably would have delayed this. You know, it was usually more in the 30s, 40s, this happens for like my Covenant ancestors. So I think that's part of it that I'm speculating a little bit, but I think I'm on pretty solid ground. But here's the other thing, and the reason I think this is well worth like a Kairos class to think about. Where does Charles Lindbergh get the notion that all of humanity is driven by racial competition? Where does he get the idea that certain life, the human life, is inferior? Right? I'm not just talking about white supremacy, but his support for eugenics. Why later in life does he write about the need to control the reproduction of lesser peoples? Right? Where is this coming from? I think partly it's he's never been confronted with a very important other idea, which is that all people are made in the image of God. Right? I think one of the important consequences of Charles Lindbergh having grown up spiritual but not religious is he skipped over that part of the Bible. He never encountered that Christian ethical tradition, that theological tradition, that there's basic human dignity for all people. And I don't mean that Christians have always been good at living this out, but Charles Lindbergh never needed to encounter it. That wasn't his God. His God ordained racial struggle and racial supremacy. And he was never challenged with a different kind of God who might believe in something like, ordain something like equality and basic dignity and worth, right? So at the end of the book, I write a kind of afterword that reflects on the fact that I was writing this not just at any time, but most of it I wrote in the kind of leading up to and then after the George Floyd death and the riots in Minneapolis. And it was really hard not to think about this in the middle of the summer of 2020. And this is kind of how I summed it up, that Charles Lindbergh, having made God in his own image, saw no image of God in people who didn't resemble him. And a million times I've thought about how I think I've come to very different views than Charles Lindbergh, partly because I came from a Swedish family that was church going, right? That if nothing else, and they were not perfect, there were anti-Semites in my family tree. They at least spent a lot of time being confronted with the idea that all humans are made in the image of God, that we are all children of God. And Charles Lindbergh never dealt with that, never talked about it, right? And he had a different kind of image of God that he sort of struggled his way to, and it fit very nicely with his ideas of eugenics and white supremacy, and I would also add anti-Semitism. So that has only a very slender connection to the Lutheran Church, but that's the other kind of story that's sort of woven in here. And that was not the story I really expected to tell. I mean, I did think it would be interesting to tell a spiritual but not religious story. I didn't expect that maybe it would connect to that story of someone who'd be a Nazi sympathizer, someone who'd be anti-Semitic, someone who would believe in eugenics and racial struggle. But I think it's inescapable that he is becoming all of those things at the same time that he's hanging out with Alexis Carrel, whose most famous book, his bestseller, is all about eugenics. This is Carrel's other great claim to fame. He's a Nobel Prize winner, a Catholic mystic, and a eugenicist who is worried that the white race was losing the purity of its blood. And so that's where Charles Lindbergh gets his idea about what humanity is like, not from the pulpit of a Lutheran church, where he might have heard that we're all made in the image of God. So I'll end the sermon there on that note. But that's the other strain of the story that you would find in the book if you're interested.
Well, what a complex character.
David has a good observation. David, do you want to give it yourself instead of my reading it? You can share that. I think it's an interesting point that some of us have perhaps been aware of in our own families. You'd have to unmute.
Yeah, I was just mentioning that the thought came to me while you were talking about the Lutheran and the German connection and Swedish immigrants. I belong to a number of Norwegian bygdelags for people of descent of Norway. And I know in some of those classes, we were told that there was a strong movement toward Americanizing among the Scandinavian immigrants during World War One, because there was a lot of animosity toward Germans, and the Scandinavian people wanted to minimize their similarity to Germans. And so even among my own ancestors, my first generation immigrant parents spoke Norwegian and had Norwegian last names. And the second generation changed their names and spoke only English. And my father remembered that dynamic was in the household between his parents and his grandmother.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fantastic point. In fact, if you're interested, I'm going to share in the chat a blog post I wrote about this over the summer, specifically about language bans that affected not just German-speaking churches, but Scandinavian-speaking churches, not just Minnesota, but Iowa is actually the most famous case for this. There was actually a law passed in May, I think May of 1918, banning public worship. So I actually quote a Norwegian pastor who writes in protest of this. Yeah, it's fascinating. I first encountered this when I did a little history of Bethel, which during World War I was a Swedish-speaking institution, at least the seminary. And in Minnesota, there was, as you might know, a committee of public safety that would investigate. And you were not allowed to publish things without permission in languages other than English. And so one thing I observed in sort of Bethel's history was a lot of very demonstrative patriotism, and then also a lot of silence. Right? They just didn't publish things. And it's important because Swedes and Norwegians generally in the United States were opposed to the US entering World War I. C.A. Lindbergh was a staunch critic of Woodrow Wilson. He actually wrote a book in 1918 suggesting that World War I was a kind of capitalist conspiracy. Right. So there in Swedes, generally, they kind of sympathized with the Germans, fellow Lutherans. The Russians were fellow enemies of theirs. So yeah, it was a very difficult time to be Scandinavian. And so I'm not surprised to hear that even in your family history, you have a little bit of that nudge towards assimilation, because it's not just German Americans who go through that.
Chris, you mentioned that Charles Lindbergh was primarily self-educated several years ago. read a fascinating book that the Lindberghs were very good friends of the Edisons and the Fords. And I'm sure Charles Lindbergh learned a lot from Henry Ford and Thomas Edison.
Yeah, I'm trying to find, sorry, I'm looking at my bookshelves here. There's a book about that there was kind of a mutual friend that connected them, who shows up a lot in my book, who was a sort of businessman who converted Christianity, could never convince Lindbergh to convert, but he was kind of Lindbergh's connection with some of those businessmen, also Firestones, but especially Henry Ford. So that's a little bit you find in the book if you're interested in that. Sorry, can't find that book.
So this was the first time I'd heard the expression America First being referred to in a long ago sort of time.
Right. Yeah, it was, I mean, that was actually when I first started research, it was 2017, right? So I kind of came up with this topic while I was on sabbatical in the fall of 2016. And I was almost like starting to write the proposal when Donald Trump was elected. And so like that was actually initially the background of the book was like, wow, America First is like a timely idea again. And we're having all these debates about isolationism again. No, America First, I think, is actually a pretty fascinating movement. And there have been some really good books written about it to try to, I think, rehabilitate it. I mean, not all of the America Firsters were Nazi sympathizers. I mean, in fact, they went out of their way to try to avoid that characterization. The anti-Semitism of Lindbergh and others, that was not tolerated. And Lindbergh was silenced after the Des Moines talk where he blamed World War II on Jews. I mean, there are left-wing parts of America First. Probably the most famous example is Norman Thomas, who was initially a Presbyterian pastor, but more famous for running as socialist candidate for president like 6 times. Norman Thomas was a prominent part of America First and got really upset at Lindbergh for his anti-Semitism. So like it's a mix. Quakers are part of this, Methodists are part of this, and it's generally out of a sense that World War I was a terrible mistake. Why would we repeat it? I think that's actually the most common idea. Plus, especially in this part of the country, like the Midwest in the 1930s is a bastion of isolationism. Like, why are we meddling in foreign affairs again? Didn't we learn our lesson in 1917, 18? We let the British trick us into one war. Why would we do this again? Even versions of the idea of, well, this is all just capitalists trying to make money off of arms sales. Why would we give into that? So like, it's a very complicated movement that in some ways it's very idealistic. I tend not to be very sympathetic to it because I spend most of my time as a professor talking about things like Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. It's hard on this end of that story to be quite as sympathetic to the idea that the US ought to have nothing to do with World War II. Certainly for Lindbergh's reasons, it's hard to be sympathetic.
So what then should we think of as Lindbergh's real legacy? What does he leave us with other than an airplane flight and a very confused life?
That's a fantastic question. I think it's what side of Lindbergh do you want to look at? So I did a talk like this for a church in Stillwater in my hometown right before Christmas. And the second part of the talk, I actually spent some time just kind of stepping back and asked, why do we write biographies? Like, what's the point of that? Is it to find praiseworthy heroes that we can emulate, which is a pretty common Christian reason for writing biography, right? We write stories of saints. Like I told people, I don't know if you can see it, but like if you look in the shelf, well, there's Homer Simpson. I was trying to hide that from you all, so you take me seriously. If you look at my shelves, like they're full of biographies of Hitler and Stalin and Mao. Like sometimes we ought to write biographies of people who terrify us, who are reprehensible. Like we ought to learn from their sins, right? Like that's an important reason. And I think it's both, right? Like I think those are all legacies of Charles Lindbergh. Like I will say, I almost want to defend Lindbergh because one reaction to the book that really bothers me is the idea you should never have published a book about Charles Lindbergh because he's such a terrible person. Right. Like, and again, like I look in my shelves and they're full of biographies of terrible people. Why would we want to ignore people who are terrible? Like, how do we learn from the past if we only look at the things that are great about the past? That's horrifying. That's the reason why I think it's so important to deal with white supremacy in American history. Like, why would we ignore that? At the same token, I think the main thing we should take away from Lindbergh is there's an American trope of the individual, right? And what is more American individual than some unknown kid who's a male pilot from the Midwest, no one's heard of before, defying all the odds to fly across the ocean, right? Like that's an American story of individualism, right? The solo pilot flying by himself and conquering nature and demonstrating technology, right? Like, I mean, Lindbergh actually went out of his way to argue against this. His first memoir that he wrote after he got back was called We, because he wanted to emphasize this was not just me. Like, mechanics had to help design this and engineers worked on this, right? And my plane was a partner in this. But I think that's kind of the Lindbergh story, is like, we do tend to celebrate individual accomplishment, and there is something admirable about someone willing to do that. It's when you look at the spiritual side of Lindbergh, like, I actually come to the other side of this kind of grateful for having grown up in organized religion. And like, those of us who have spent most of our lives in churches know how flawed churches are, and we know how hypocritical Christianity is, and we know how it falls short. But I am so glad that I've been part of churches, because it means I can't just pick my beliefs for myself, right? I actually have to be confronted by what a pastor says to me from the pulpit. I actually have to look at a library of scriptures that are difficult and complicated and seem contradictory and try to figure out what I make of them. And I've got to be part of a community with people who are different and don't think like I do. Those are actually all good things that Charles Lindbergh consciously spent his life avoiding. And that's a kind of individualism I think that's how you wind up possibly with unchallenged, dangerous beliefs, like the kind that I just mentioned from Charles Lindbergh. So I think it's in some ways a story of the problems and possibilities of American individualism. I'll put it that way. If I had to sum it all up as one thing, that's Charles Lindbergh's legacy to me.
Well, that sounds like a good note to end on. A fascinating story about a fascinating and conflicted person. And thank goodness we have dedicated academics to look into these things and to analyze them for us and make us think.
Sure. Well, I appreciate you having me. I can talk about the airport question of someone, if you wanted me to spend 2 more minutes. Someone had asked.
Yes, please do.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually a raging question. I don't know if you know, but it's being debated, not just airports, although like the San Diego airport had its name taken away a while ago. I think it is one of the reasons we use Terminal 1 instead of the Lindbergh terminal, is to avoid that question without dealing with it. But like Hopkins High School, I think, has a gymnasium named for Lindbergh. There's a debate on the school board there about it. I think it's Milwaukee had a park named after Lindbergh, and they changed its name last year to the name of a civil rights activist. So in much the same way, I think there's been a rethinking of like naming things after Confederate generals, right? Naming things after slave-holding founding fathers. Like, I think this is a fair conversation to have. I mean, I will defend the necessity of writing biographies about people like this, because I think that's what historians should do, and it makes us better students of history. I am not going to stand here to argue that we owe it to Charles Lindbergh to name an airport after him. I think there are other people we can name things after at this point. I tend not to buy the idea that we'll forget the past if we strip names off them. I think memory is a much more fluid thing than that. We rename things all the time. That shouldn't bother us at all. And there are good reasons at least to have the debate over it. So that's my 2 cents on that debate. I will say, if I can be mercantile at least a little bit here, if you're interested in buying a copy, I put a couple of links in the chat window. I think it's like $24 on Amazon. If you'd rather, World of Books is a nice site. It's a collection of independent bookstores, so you can buy the book through that. If you want a signed copy, I'm happy to do that. You can email me at the email address there. Or if you want, I actually will be at the Northtown Library in Blaine on Saturday, February 12th for a local authors event. So I'll have copies of the book at a table. We can talk in person a little bit if you're interested. So I'll leave that slide up if you want to jot down any of that information.
Okay,
Great.
thank you so much. Are there any other questions or comments? Okay, if not, I will inform you that 2 weeks from tonight, we have Katie Langston, who has written a book called Latter-day Saint to Lutheran. That should be an interesting journey.
I've read about her. That's great that you got her. It's quite a story.
So we will,
This is a person who's gone from she's gone from a Mormon to becoming a Lutheran pastor, and she's has a real pivotal role at Luther Seminary in some of their online education. And then, so you don't forget, in February, we have 2 sessions with on the Bible with Gary Anderson.
yes.
So we hope you'll all be back.
Yes, so it's every let's see. Yes,
It's the second and fourth.
second and fourth Monday of the month. And we
Mhm.
almost
Or
never
something like
fail
that.
to
Well,
have
actually,
a fascinating speaker.
I
So-
think it's actually, I'm not sure. The second and fourth isn't exactly correct, but anyway, it's 2 Mondays in each month, I believe. I believe in February and March, I think it's the 1st and 3rd.
Okay, well, they're all on the
Website.
information website anyway, so. Thanks very much.
Thank you,
for
Chris.
Attending, and thank you, Dr. Gehrz.
Thank you. Let's give him a round of applause as we can here.
Yes, terrific. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
No, it was a pleasure to do this. I had a great time.
Thank you.